The translators failed 3 times before anyone understood what the old woman had said. Ruth Okonkwo sat in the human delegation's chair, surrounded by 700 alien species in the Great Hall of Meridian Station. She was 67 years old. Her hair had gone gray 15 years ago. Her hands showed the spots of age, but her eyes were sharp, watching, waiting. The Velothi High Speaker towered above the assembly. He stood 7 feet tall, his body covered in hard plates like armor. His arms ended in curved blades. His species had conquered 17 worlds. They had never lost a war. Humanity has 30 cycles to surrender all colony worlds, the High Speaker announced. His voice echoed through the chamber. You have expanded too fast. You have made alliances with species beneath your station. You have disrupted the natural order of the galaxy. Ruth said nothing. She simply listened. If you refuse, the High Speaker continued, the Velothi hegemony will begin systematic cleansing of your species. This is not a threat. This is a promise. We have done this before. We will do it again. The chamber fell silent. Every species watched the human delegation. They expected panic. They expected begging. They had seen it many times before. Young species always broke when the Velothi spoke. Ruth leaned back in her chair. A small smile crossed her weathered face. She turned to her aide, a reptilian woman named Sethri, and whispered 2 words. Finally, the word carried. In a chamber designed to capture every sound, nothing stayed private. The translators picked it up. They processed it. They broadcast it to 700 species. Finally, the Velothi High Speaker froze. His blade arms twitched. You find this amusing, human? Ruth stood slowly. She took her time. She straightened her jacket. She looked up at the creature that had just threatened her entire species with extinction. The Terran Union accepts your declaration of war, she said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. We will respond in kind. She turned and walked toward the exit. Her aide followed. The chamber erupted in chaos behind her, but Ruth did not look back. Outside the Great Hall, Admiral Pavel Nowak waited. He was 54, built like a soldier who had never stopped training. He had been Ruth's friend for 40 years, since they were both young officers in the Fringe Wars. It's done, he asked. It's done. Ruth pulled out a small communicator. Send the signal. The wolves are loose. Pavel nodded. His face showed no surprise. They had planned for this day for 4 decades. The fleet will be ready in 6 hours. Good. They walked together through the station corridors. Alien species stepped aside, watching them with confusion. Why weren't the humans running? Why weren't they crying? The Velothi had just sentenced them to death. Sethri caught up with them, her tail swishing nervously. Ambassador, forgive me, but you seemed almost happy in there. Ruth stopped walking. She looked at the young Kisari woman who had served her for 5 years. Do you know why I took this position, Sethri? To serve your people? Partly. Ruth started walking again. 40 years ago, the Velothi destroyed a human colony called New Brisbane. 90,000 people. They did it because we refused to give them mining rights to an asteroid field. Sethri said nothing. She had heard stories of the Fringe Wars, but humans rarely spoke of them directly. My daughter was on New Brisbane, Ruth continued. She was 23. She was a teacher. She'd just gotten engaged. Ruth's voice remained steady. The Velothi didn't even remember her name. To them, she was just a number. Collateral damage in a trade dispute. Ambassador, I'm sorry. I didn't know. After that, I made a choice. Ruth reached the human section of the station. Guards stood at attention as she passed. I would never let it happen again. Pavel and we built something. Hidden shipyards, secret alliances, training programs. We spent 40 years preparing for the day some fool would declare war on humanity. She stopped at her quarters and turned to face both Pavel and Sethri. The Velothi think they're starting a war today. They're wrong. They're finishing one. One that began when they killed my daughter and 90,000 others. Pavel put his hand on her shoulder. Ruth, are you sure about this? Once it starts, there's no going back. Ruth smiled again. The same smile from the assembly hall. It didn't reach her eyes. I've been sure for 40 years, Pavel. Every day, I watch them bully smaller species. Every day, I watch them threaten and conquer. Every day I waited. She opened her door. And now, finally, they've given us a reason to show them what humanity really is. The door closed behind her. Pavel looked at Sethri. You should know something about humans, he said quietly. We're patient. We plan. We build. And when someone hurts us badly enough, we don't forget. We don't forgive. We wait. Wait for what? Pavel's expression hardened. For them to make a mistake. He turned and walked toward the docking bay where his ship waited. The Velothi just made theirs. Across the galaxy, hidden shipyards began to wake. Ships that existed on no registry powered up their engines. Soldiers who had trained in secret received their orders. And Ruth Okonkwo sat alone in her quarters, holding a photograph of a young woman with her same smile. Soon, my love, she whispered. Soon. The war had begun. The farmer's daughter shot first. Her name was Lena, and she was 17 years old. She had never held a weapon before the Velothi landing craft appeared over Avalon 3. Now she crouched behind a tractor, her grandfather's hunting rifle pressed against her shoulder, watching the invaders march through her family's wheat field. The Velothi expected no resistance. This was a farming colony. 80,000 civilians. No military presence. Easy conquest. Lena pulled the trigger. The shot missed. But the sound echoed across the valley. And suddenly, from every farmhouse, every barn, every hiding spot, more shots rang out. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, children barely old enough to aim. They fired with old rifles, homemade weapons, and in some cases just threw rocks. Commander Vreth of the Velothi 3rd Division stood in his command ship and watched his troops fall. Not many. Human weapons were primitive, but they fell. This is impossible, he said to his second officer. Civilians do not fight. It is not logical. They cannot win. Should we withdraw, Commander? Vreth's blade arms clicked with anger. No, kill them all. Make an example. Back on Meridian Station, High Commander Crix received the battle reports. He was different from Vreth. Older, more thoughtful. He had studied alien species his entire life. Casualties, he asked. 230 dead, Commander. 400 wounded. From farmers? Yes, Commander. Crix said nothing for a long moment. He pulled up records of the human species. Their history. Their wars. He read about places called Stalingrad, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Names that meant nothing to the hegemony's databases, but the patterns told a story. Humans did not surrender. Ever. Meanwhile, in the dark spaces between stars, humanity's secret revealed itself. Admiral Pavel Nowak stood on the bridge of the TNS Vendetta, flagship of the Terran Second Fleet. Around him, 400 warships emerged from hidden bases. They had names that made alien translators struggle. Reckoning. No quarter. Memento Mori. All ships reporting ready, Admiral, his first officer announced. Pavel nodded. He opened a channel to the entire fleet. Today, the Velothi attacked a farming colony. They expected easy targets. They found humans instead. He paused. In 1 hour, we jumped to Cressith system. The enemy has 600 ships there. We have 400. They think those numbers mean they'll win. He smiled grimly. They've never fought us before. Let's educate them. On Avalon 3, the fighting continued for 3 days. The Velothi took the planet, but the cost was enormous. 10 times their expected casualties. And worse, word spread through the galaxy. A captured farmer, bleeding from wounds that would kill him within hours, laughed in Commander Vreth's face. You think this was bad? He said through broken teeth. Wait until the real soldiers show up. Vreth executed him personally, but the word stayed with him. Ruth Okonkwo received the casualty reports on Meridian Station. 42,000 dead on Avalon 3, more than half the colony's population. She read every name, her face showing no emotion. Sethri watched her ambassador work through the night. You don't sleep anymore, she observed. I'll sleep when it's over. Ruth added the names to a file, a list she had kept for 40 years. It had grown from 90,000 to over 130,000 now. Every name. I remember every name. Why? Because someone has to. Ruth closed the file and opened a communication channel. Pavel, how long until you reach Cressith? 6 hours. The Admiral's voice was calm. We have a surprise for them. What kind of surprise? The kind they'll remember for 1,000 years. Ruth allowed herself a small smile. Don't die out there, old friend. Not planning on it. But if I do, make sure they pay for it. The channel closed. Ruth sat in the darkness, surrounded by death counts and battle plans. 40 years of preparation. Hidden ships. Secret training. Allies cultivated in shadows. All of it coming together now. She thought about her daughter. About the life she should have had. The children she should have raised. The old age she should have reached. The Velothi had taken all of that away with a single orbital strike. They hadn't even bothered to learn her name. Ruth stood and walked to her window. Outside, the stars glittered cold and distant. Somewhere out there, Pavel was preparing to show the galaxy what humanity could do. Somewhere out there, Velothi soldiers were learning that humans didn't break like other species. They think we're weak because we care about each other, she said to the empty room. They think emotions make us soft. They have no idea. Her communicator beeped. A message from the Kesari government. They wanted to discuss alliance terms. Ruth smiled again. The Velothi had ruled through fear for centuries. They had never considered that fear could work against them, that the species they had bullied might find hope in watching someone fight back. Ruth composed her reply. Simple words. Powerful words. The Terran Union welcomes allies who refuse to be conquered. Stand with us, and we will stand with you. Not as masters, as friends. She sent the message and turned back to her casualty reports. The war had only begun. The worst was yet to come. But for the first time in 40 years, Ruth Okonkwo felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The Velothi formation was perfect. 600 ships arranged in the ancient pattern that had won them 17 wars. Overlapping fields of fire. Defensive spacing. Everything by the book. Then the humans arrived, and the book burned. Admiral Pavel Nowak watched the enemy fleet through his ship's sensors. Beautiful formation. Textbook positioning. Exactly what he had expected. All ships, he said calmly. Full acceleration. Straight at them. His first officer turned pale. Sir, that will put us directly in their crossfire. Yes, it will. Pavel leaned forward. Do it. The Terran fleet moved as one. 400 ships accelerating at speeds that should have been impossible. The Velothi watched their sensors with confusion. This wasn't how war worked. Inferior forces ran away. They didn't charge. Commander Vreth, leading the Velothi formation, gave the obvious order. Fire. All weapons. Space lit up with plasma and particle beams. The Velothi expected the humans to break. To scatter. 2D. The humans kept coming. Ships took hits. Hull breaches opened across a dozen vessels. But the Terran fleet didn't slow down. They flew straight into the wall of fire, shields flickering, armor burning, crews dying at their stations. And then they were through. Pavel's voice echoed across the battle network. All ships, scatter pattern delta. Find a target and kill it. The perfect Velothi formation became chaos. Human ships weaved between their larger opponents, firing at point-blank range where the enemy's long-range weapons meant nothing. Velothi ships tried to target their attackers and hit each other instead. Commander Vreth watched a human destroyer attach itself to a Velothi cruiser. The destroyer was burning. Half its crew was dead, but its weapons kept firing, tearing through the cruiser's hull from inches away. They're insane, Vreth whispered. It got worse. Human crews in damaged ships began ejecting. But they didn't flee. They flew their emergency suits toward enemy vessels and forced their way inside. Hand-to-hand combat in the corridors of Velothi warships. Humans with knives and pistols against armored warriors with blade arms. The humans died in droves. But so did the Velothi, and there were always more humans coming. 3 hours later, the battle ended. 340 Velothi ships destroyed. 89 human ships lost. The Velothi retreated in disorder, leaving their dead behind. High Commander Crix watched the battle recordings from his command post. He watched human pilots deliberately crash their dying ships into enemy vessels. He watched wounded soldiers drag themselves across burning decks to reach their enemies. He watched a species that refused to accept defeat. Send this to the matriarch, he told his aide. She needs to see what we're fighting. The matriarch's response came within the hour. Send more ships. Overwhelm them with numbers. Crick stared at the message for a long time. The matriarch had ruled for 60 years. She had never lost. She believed victory was simply a matter of force. She didn't understand what they were facing. Ruth Okonkwo received the news of the victory with quiet satisfaction. 89 ships, thousands of lives, a price that would have broken most species. But the galaxy was watching, and what they saw changed everything. Her communicator filled with messages. The Kesari formally requested alliance. The Moldari offered their repair stations as neutral ground. The Bright Eyes, a species the Velothi had threatened into submission for 3 centuries, asked for protection. Ruth answered every message personally. To the Kesari, your courage honors us. We will fight together. To the Moldari, your help will save lives. We will not forget. To the Bright Eyes, no one stands alone anymore. Welcome to the Alliance. Sethri watched her ambassador work, sending messages, coordinating supplies, building a coalition from nothing. You're not just fighting a war, she realized. You're building something. The Velothi rule through fear, Ruth explained. They make species believe they have no choice. But we just showed the galaxy something important. What? That the Velothi can bleed. Ruth smiled. Fear only works until someone proves it wrong. And once it's broken, it never comes back. News of the battle spread across 1,000 worlds. Species that had lived under Velothi threat watched recordings of human ships charging into impossible odds. They saw warriors who should have run, instead fighting to the death. They saw hope. Pavel Nowak reported to Ruth from his battered flagship. His uniform was torn. His face was cut, but his eyes burned with something fierce. We hurt them, Ruth. We hurt them badly. I know, but they'll send more. Let them. Pavel's voice was iron. We'll teach them the same lesson, as many times as it takes. Ruth nodded. Get your ships repaired. This was just the beginning. I know, Pavel boasted. Ruth, the crews are asking about you. They want to know if you're proud of them. Ruth thought about the cost. 89 ships, thousands of names to add to her list. Families that would never see their loved ones again. But they had chosen this. Every one of them. They had known the risks and decided that some things were worth dying for. Tell them I am proud, she said softly. Tell them their sacrifice will be remembered. And tell them this, we're just getting started. The transmission ended. Ruth sat alone in her quarters, surrounded by reports and plans and casualty lists. The war had truly begun now. The Velothi would respond with everything they had, and humanity would answer. Because that was what they did. They answered. They fought. They refused to break. And somewhere in the darkness, the other species of the galaxy began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the monsters could be beaten. The child was 5 years old when the Velothi destroyed her transport. She floated in a debris field for 3 hours before human rescue ships found her. Both her parents were gone. Her entire colony was gone. She didn't understand why. Ruth Okonkwo held the girl's hand in the medical bay of a refugee ship. The child's name was Ani. She had brown eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Where are my mom and dad? Ani asked. Ruth had no good answer. She had learned long ago that some questions couldn't be answered with words. So she simply held the child's hand and stayed silent. The war was 4 months old now. The Velothi had committed their full military. Thousands of ships poured into human space. Colony worlds fell one after another. For every Velothi vessel destroyed, 3 more took its place. Humanity was losing. The Alliance helped. Kesari intelligence prevented ambushes. Moldari repair stations kept damaged ships fighting. But it wasn't enough. The Velothi had spent centuries building their war machine. Humanity had spent 40 years. 40 years wasn't enough. Ruth returned to her quarters after leaving Ani with the medical staff. She found a message waiting from her sister's family on Earth's Orbital 3. A birthday invitation for her nephew. A simple family gathering. 6 hours later, a second message arrived. Orbital 3 had been destroyed. No survivors. Ruth read the message twice. Then she closed it and went back to work. Sethri found her 3 hours later, still at her desk, still reading reports. Ambassador, You need to rest. I'll rest when it's over. Your sister is dead. Ruth's hand stopped moving on her console. I know. You haven't grieved. You haven't stopped working. You haven't even cried. I don't have time for grief. Ruth's voice was flat, empty. Every hour I spend crying is an hour I'm not working. And people are dying. Sethri sat down across from her. How do you continue? How do you keep going when you've lost so much? Ruth finally looked up. Her eyes were dry, but something broken lurked behind them. Because stopping means they died for nothing. My daughter, my sister, the soldiers, the civilians, all of them. She stood and walked to her window. If I stop, their deaths become meaningless. I won't allow that. On the front lines, Admiral Pavel Nowak fought with everything he had. His fleet had been reinforced, rebuilt, and reinforced again. Every ship that fell was replaced by 2 more. Humanity was learning. They called it splintering. When a human ship was too damaged to fight, its crew would aim it at the largest enemy target and eject at the last moment. The Velothi began fearing beaten human ships more than fresh ones. Human engineers worked constantly, modifying weapons, improving shields, finding new ways to hurt the enemy. What worked on Monday was obsolete by Friday. The Velothi followed their ancient doctrines. Humans rewrote the rules daily, but it still wasn't enough. High Commander Crix studied humanity obsessively. He read their literature, their history, their philosophy. He watched their entertainment and listened to their music. He tried to understand what made them different from every other species the hegemony had conquered. The answer terrified him. Humans didn't fight to win. They fought until there was nothing left. Victory meant nothing to them compared to survival. They would burn their own worlds before surrendering them. They would die in the millions if it meant their enemies died too. Crix sent a private message to the matriarch. Request permission to negotiate terms. The response came immediately. There will be no terms. Continue the extermination. Crix stared at the message for hours. The matriarch didn't understand. She couldn't understand. She had never faced an enemy who would rather destroy themselves than submit. Ruth Okonkwo addressed the Alliance via holographic broadcast. Her image appeared on 1,000 worlds to 100 species in the middle of the worst war any of them had ever seen. They thought we would break, she said. Her voice was tired but steady. They thought grief would stop us. They thought if they killed enough of us, the rest would surrender. She paused. Her eyes found the camera. Every being watching felt she was speaking directly to them. They were wrong. She continued. Every friend we've lost is a reason to continue. Every world we've bled for is a world we will reclaim. The Velothi wanted a war. They got one, and we don't stop. The broadcast ended. Across the Alliance, soldiers who had been ready to give up found new strength. Engineers who had been working for days without sleep went back to their stations. Pilots climbed into cockpits they didn't expect to leave, not because they thought they would win, but because someone had to try. Ruth sat alone after the broadcast. She pulled out the photograph of her daughter, then another photograph, her sister's family. She looked at them for a long time. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you, but I will make this mean something. I promise. She put the photographs away and went back to work. There were plans to review, allies to coordinate, a war to fight. Outside her window, the stars kept burning, cold and distant and uncaring. But somewhere in that darkness, human ships were fighting. Human soldiers were dying. Human families were grieving. And humanity was not giving up. 3,000 ships blotted out the stars above Earth. The matriarch had committed everything. Every warship, every transport, every fighter the hegemony possessed. If they destroyed humanity's homeworld, the war would end. The Alliance would collapse. Order would be restored. Ruth Okonkwo looked at the tactical display in Earth's Defense Center. 1,200 Allied ships stood between the enemy and her world. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. Admiral Pavel Nowak sat beside her, his face grim. We can't win a straight fight. I know, so we don't fight straight. Pavel pulled up a plan on the display. Lines and arrows and positions that looked like madness. It's insane. It probably won't work. But it's our only chance. Ruth studied the plan. It required everything. Every trick. Every sacrifice. Every desperate measure humanity had learned in 8 months of war, and it required bait. "I'll do it," Ruth said. Pavel started to object. Ruth held up her hand. "You need a ship broadcasting on all frequencies, making the Velothi focus on one target. It needs to be someone important, someone they'll want to capture." She smiled. "I've been waiting 40 years for this, Pavel. Let me finish it." 6 hours later, Ruth's diplomatic vessel hung alone in space, directly in the path of the Velothi Armada. A single small ship facing 3,000 warships. Ruth opened a channel. "Hi, Commander Crix. I know you're reading our histories. I know you understand what we are now." On the Velothi flagship, Crix listened. He had studied this woman for months. He knew about her daughter, her sister, her 40 years of preparation. He respected her more than he wanted to admit. "This is your last chance," Ruth continued. "Withdraw, and we can discuss peace. Continue, and we will show you what humanity does when our home is threatened." Crix considered her words. He knew she was right. He had seen what humans did when cornered. He had read the reports. He had watched his own soldiers die in ways that haunted his sleep. But the matriarch's orders were absolute. "Forward," Crix commanded. "All ships." The Velothi Armada advanced. 3,000 ships moving toward Earth like a wave of death. Then Ruth's trap sprung. The Allied fleet emerged from hiding. From behind the moon. From within asteroid fields. From positions that should have been impossible to hold. 1,200 ships appearing where nothing should exist. But that wasn't the trap. The trap was the civilian ships. Thousands of them. Mining vessels. Cargofrates. Personal craft. Family shuttles. All of them modified with splinter drives. All of them crewed by volunteers who had decided their homeworld was worth their lives. Farmers. Teachers. Engineers. Parents. Children barely old enough to fly. They charged. The Velothi line shattered. Their formations broke as civilian ships smashed into warships at full speed. Not military pilots. Not trained soldiers. Just ordinary people who refused to watch their world burn. Crix watched his fleet die. He watched ships that had conquered 17 species torn apart by miners and shopkeepers. He saw everything he believed about war proven wrong. And he made a choice. "All vessels," he broadcast on open channel. "Cease fire and withdraw. This is High Commander Crix, assuming emergency authority. The war is over." Half his fleet obeyed. The loyal ones. The ones who had served under him for years. They powered down weapons and pulled back. The other half, loyal to the matriarch, kept fighting. The battle became civil war within a battle. Velothi fighting Velothi while humans watched in shock. The Great Armada tore itself apart as two visions of the future collided. Ruth watched from her ship. She didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Thousands of civilian volunteers had died in the last hour. More would die before this was over. But they had won. Her communicator buzzed. Pavel's voice, exhausted but alive. "Ruth, it's done. Crix is broadcasting surrender on all frequencies. The matriarch, her loyalists are collapsing. Crix has more support than she expected." Ruth closed her eyes. 40 years. 40 years of planning and waiting and losing everyone she loved. And now, finally, it was almost over. "Ruth," Pavel's voice softened. "Are you okay?" She thought about her daughter, her sister, the colonists on Avalon 3, the crews of 89 ships at Cressith, the civilians who had flown into the enemy fleet an hour ago, knowing they wouldn't come back. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." She opened a channel to the Alliance. "All forces cease fire. The enemy is surrendering. Repeat, the enemy is surrendering. This war is over." Across the fleet, exhausted crews heard the words they had stopped believing they would ever hear. Some cheered, some cried, some simply sat in silence, too tired to feel anything. Ruth sat alone on her small ship, watching the Velothi Armada fall apart. Crix's forces were rounding up the matriarch's loyalists. Earth's defenses stood down. The stars, for the first time in 8 months, looked peaceful. She pulled out her photograph. Her daughter's face smiled back at her. "It's done," Ruth whispered. "It's finally done." Somewhere in the distance, the sun began to rise over Earth. A new day, a new future. Ruth watched the light spread across her homeworld and allowed herself, for the first time in 40 years, to hope. The garden grew slowly, but Ruth had learned patience. 1 year after the war ended, she lived on a small colony world called Haven. She had a house with a wooden porch. She had a garden with flowers and vegetables. She had peace. The treaty had been signed in the same hall where the war was declared. Ruth had shaken hands with the new Velothi leadership while the galaxy watched. The terms were fair. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just fairness. Some had called her weak for that. Human politicians who wanted blood. Grieving families who wanted the Velothi to suffer. Ruth understood their anger. She shared it. But she had looked at the Velothi delegates across the table and seen something familiar in their eyes. Fear. Shame. Desperate hope that this nightmare might end. They had lost too. Their matriarch was gone. Their empire had shattered. Half their fleet had destroyed the other half. They weren't monsters. They were a species that had chosen wrong and paid for it. We will not become what we fought, Ruth had said during the negotiations. We will not rule through fear. We will not demand tribute. We will be partners, or we will be nothing. The Velothi joined the alliance as equals. Not subjects. Not conquered peoples. Equals. Now, a year later, Ruth tended her garden and tried to remember what peace felt like. A shuttle landed on her property one afternoon. She watched it without surprise. She had been expecting this visitor. High Commander Crix walked down the ramp. He looked different outside of his armor. Smaller. Older. His blade arms hung loosely at his sides, not ready for combat. Ambassador Okonkwo. He stopped at the edge of her garden. Thank you for seeing me. You're not a commander anymore, Ruth said. And I'm not an ambassador. Just Ruth. Then just Crix. He looked at the flowers growing in neat rows. I didn't know humans grew things. We grow many things. Food. Flowers. Children. Ruth set down her gardening tools. Would you like some tea? They sat on her porch, two former enemies, drinking tea from simple cups. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. I came to ask you something, Crix said finally. A question that has haunted me since the assembly hall. Ruth nodded. She knew what he would ask. When you said finally, Crix continued. What did you mean? The matriarch declared war on your entire species. Everyone expected terror, panic, surrender. Instead, you smiled. You said, finally. What? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. She watched the sunset. She thought about her answer. 40 years ago, she began, your hegemony destroyed a human colony called New Brisbane. 90,000 people died, including my daughter. Crix said nothing. He had read the files. He knew the history. After that, I made a promise. To her. To myself. To everyone we lost. Ruth's voice was soft but steady. I promised I would never let it happen again. And I kept that promise. By building a secret fleet. By planning for war. By preparing for the day you would make a mistake. Ruth finally looked at him. I watched your hegemony for 40 years. I watched you threaten and conquer and destroy. I watched species surrender because they thought they had no choice. And I built ships, alliances, plans, always waiting. Waiting for what? For you to think we were like everyone else. Ruth smiled. The same smile from the assembly hall. But this time it reached her eyes. When your matriarch declared war, I wasn't afraid. I was relieved. Finally, after 40 years of preparation, I could show you who we really are. And who is that? Ruth looked at the sunset again. Not conquerors, not victims, just people who protect each other, no matter the cost. They sat in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Stars began to appear, one by one, filling the darkening sky. I never understood humans, Crix admitted. I studied you for months. Your history, your culture, your wars. I thought I knew what you were. I was wrong. What do you think we are now? Crix considered the question carefully. I think you're the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not because of your weapons or your ships, but because you care about each other more than you fear death. Ruth laughed. A real laugh, the first one in longer than she could remember. That might be the most human thing you've ever said. Perhaps I'm learning. The stars were fully out now. Somewhere up there, ships carried passengers between worlds that had been enemies a year ago. Humans and Velothi and Kesari and dozens of other species, all learning to live together. The door behind them opened. Little Ani, the girl Ruth had found in the debris field, walked onto the porch. She was 6 now. Behind her came a Velothi child, smaller than Crix, barely up to Ani's shoulder. "Can we play in the garden?" Ani asked. Ruth looked at Crix. He looked at the children. "Yes," Ruth said. "Just don't step on the tomatoes." The children ran off, laughing together. Human and Velothi, chasing each other through rows of flowers, forgetting that their species had ever been at war. Ruth watched them play. The weight she had carried for 40 years felt lighter somehow. "That," she said softly, "is why I didn't want revenge. In 50 years, I want those children to play together without remembering why their grandparents hated each other. That's worth more than any punishment we could inflict." Crix watched the children too. For the first time in his life, he understood what he was seeing. Hope, growing like flowers in a garden. And finally, Ruth allowed herself to rest.